I should
Bill?
do the days of cats and fascism. For this.
That would be a lecture I would pay extra for.
They're both,
That would be a
both have
good
taken over the internet.
Wonderful. Oh my gosh.
All over YouTube.
Well, let me introduce you, Isaiah, and then we will give the screen and the virtual floor to you. Welcome, everybody. Not everybody, I think almost everybody is here, not quite yet, but almost everyone. We are having today our guest presenter, also Advanced Honors alum, Mr. Isaiah McNair-Wilson. And he, what is it? I think 2017, is that when you were in the class, or was it 2016, 2017, I think?
2016, 2017.
Yes, yes. Okay, so that was several years ago. And over the course of time, Isaiah has become very much a sort of person of the region. Can we characterize you as a sort of culture critic, a social, political, and cultural maven? I would suggest someone who really understands the local politics and culture of the era and area. You've written for San Jose Spotlight, which is a local and community online news source. And you've written for Content Magazine, which is a regional culture publication. And you could also maybe tell us a little bit about the work that you do, Isaiah, as you move us into your presentation today, which will be fascism in the United States.
Thank you, Professor, very much. I guess without further ado, we can just get started on the presentation. Let's see. Does it look fine, everybody? Okay, so we can get started. I will introduce myself again, but we'll just kind of go into what fascism is in the United States. You know, in political conversations, the term fascism gets thrown around a lot as kind of like just the kind of go-to term for someone who you just don't like, someone's very dangerous. And there's a reason why. This is one of the most dangerous political, social, and philosophical ideas of the 20th century. Whether you think of, you know, Nazis invading Poland, you know, fascist Italy attacking Ethiopia, the Spanish Civil War, all these, like, fascism was in the backbone of all these different like movements, and it's created some of the most like dangerous and most powerful kind of forms of like collective movements that unravel democracy. And a lot of the times it kind of functions similarly as like almost like a cancer, where it engulfs just the this from the education system, the government, the political system. It just engulfs every aspect of society. And if you don't detect it early, it can be too late, where it just takes over the entire nation. So we're going to discuss fascism as far as it's concerned in the United States. And sorry, one moment. There we go. So just to give a quick content warning, we're going to be discussing a lot of different things, such as hate crimes, racism, misogyny, violent assaults, homophobia, Nazism. This is meant to just kind of say that we're not going to just be discussing fascism in the abstract and just the definition of philosophy, but the way it applies to the real world. So we'll be discussing some real world examples of it. This is just meant to prepare the class that we'll be discussing some pretty heavy topics. There won't be any gratuitous imagery depicting things like the Holocaust or chattel slavery or even hate crimes, but it's just going to be brought up. I just wanted to have that be pointed out. So my name is Isaiah McNair-Wilson, as I mentioned. I love the introduction that professor gave me, but I'm just a guy who went to your college once. I graduated in a degree of marketing, and I currently work in a company that focuses on marketing and programming public events, which, as you can imagine, be very difficult during COVID. I don't have a good photo of myself, so I just found this really good stock image of this guy, which looks really nice. And I just kind of want to point out that I am just a student just like you guys were, or I was a student like you are now. And just, I think it's really important, the class that you're taking and the things that you're reading. And I really encourage you to grow with what you've learned in this class and apply it to your day-to-day life. Because my background's in like a business, in the business degree. And some things I'll be discussing is very much against what I was taught at San Jose State. So it's important to grow that knowledge in different ways and different aspects. You don't have to be in necessarily academic setting in order to keep pursuing academia as a whole. So let's discuss just fascism, just like kind of the border plates of the basics of what it is. It's very much anti-democratic. It's both a political and social philosophy. It's very ultra-nationalistic. It comes from kind of this concept of the state itself, like the idea of the state having unilateral control over the economy, the education, society. It exists under one hegemonic party. And Jason Stanley, who wrote the book How Fascism Works, which I read in order to kind of understand fascism better, he described it as displacing reality through power, often through violence. And one thing I want to point about fascism is that it usually, it occurred kind of it began in the 1930s in a time when the world was in this global crisis. You had the Great Depression that just happened. There was people still recovering from World War II, many countries. And there were different socialists, communists, and other leftist movements that were going on throughout Eastern Europe and other parts of the world. And so fascism kind of came about as kind of this bringing back the idea of the state and this kind of this mythic idea of the great empire. And it was founded by Benito Mussolini and Giovanni Gentile. It was the concept of having kind of a spiritual connection to the state. And when I say spiritual, it's something that Mussolini and Gentile talk about in the Doctrines of Fascism, because it kind of creates this mythic idea of an empire. And this kind of use of mystical imagery is very common among fascist movements, both the ones of the early 1930s as well as ones in the modern day. It presented some of the failings of classical liberalism that was occurring at the time. We had the Great Depression, the Great World War, where it showed that there were these flaws and these kind of new age ideals. And then also it recognized the flaws of and the anxieties people had towards the idea of a socialist movement coming over and taking over a country. And so basically fascism was kind of seen as a means of regimenting the entire people, not just the government under one party, but the entire people under one party. And so when you look at things like the Nazi Party or even Franco's Spain, you kind of see this idea of everything being just regimented around this ultra nationalism. So instead of kind of going into the details of like fascism as a philosophy, we're going to be breaking it down as far as its politics, or you can think of it as its values. These are the characteristics that make up a fascist movement. These are all very critical for a fascist uprising to happen. And these politics may not be unique to fascism, but every fascist movement needs these policies and these values in order to exist. All fascist movements are different, and which is why there's a lot of debate over who constitutes a fascist or not. But if you do some of the reading, and if you kind of read some history of it, you kind of notice these certain patterns. And I would argue that these are the things that make up a fascist. And once again, these come from Jason Stanley's book, but I added a few more of my own fascist values that I found from both reading his book as well as other just historical notes about different fascist movements. So I'm just going to go over them really quickly. We're going to break them all down into detail. This should be in the outline as well, but a mythic past, hierarchies, victimhood, sexual anxiety. We'll be calling it anti-feminism, but we're going to go into it a little bit deeper, but just think of it that way when you hear the word sexual anxiety. Anti-intellectualism, propaganda, law and order, and then the one with the asterisk is one that I added, which is violence for the sake of violence, which we'll also discuss more. So the mythic past is basically tying a nation to an uncritical and an accurate glorified past of greatness. It's borrowed from Gentile's neo-Hegelian ideas. You guys are all familiar with the Hegelian dialectic, kind of this idea that throughout history, there are certain kind of dominant cultures which exist, which kind of lead humanity and civilization to kind of the next step forward. This is something that Gentile kind of developed and kind of believed in, but used it in the sense of this great idea of like this Roman Empire. And even the term fascist comes from the Latin word fascis, which is like a bundle of elm or birch rods that were used as a symbol of authority in ancient Rome. This is kind of connects this idea of like, we were once this Greco-Romanian period of like, we're this great Roman Empire, and we need to come back to this sense of greatness. And this is usually backed up by hierarchies. It's often tied to belief in either a racial, ethnic, social, or gender-based hierarchy. It implies a belief that there were an elite group of people that existed, which were the ones who were in charge when things were better. This is kind of the ways in which fascism kind of succeeds, is that it kind of adheres to this dominant social class that are seeing these changes that are happening in their country. The perceived decline that was going on due to like Great Depressions and other things going on in the nations, and kind of like this connection to this like kind of myopic past that existed at this time. And accompanied with that is anti-intellectualism. This is the contempt for institutions of education and art that challenges fascist values, notably science, social science, political art, and history. If you have a good understanding of science, social sciences, and history, you're not going to really buy into the idea of a hierarchy and a mythic past. And so when I say anti-intellectual, this doesn't mean these are people who didn't like education. As some of you know, Nazis and these are like the Nazis and Gentile, and these are like quote unquote intellectuals in the sense that they were very intelligent people, but they would pick and choose what they believed to be facts and reason, which is kind of this displacement of reality and truth, but not just in the literal sense of like attacks on the press, but also just things that were kind of ingrained truths. Accompanied with this is a sexual anxiety. This is basically the tangible insecurity and identity crisis recognized by the changing of gender dynamics. Oftentimes, fascist movements have these paramilitary groups that exist, like the black shirts or the brown shirts, or I might mispronounce this, but the Falange, which is kind of was this like very nationalistic front, which existed in Spain at the time. These are usually made up of war-hardened men who kind of felt like they're losing their place in their nation. And so this idea of a mythic ultranationalistic past appealed to these people because they were men who had just, fought and risked their lives for war and wanted to come back to this great nation. And these fascists were charismatic and offered this greater hope for the country at the time. Propaganda, this is basically communicating a further agenda. I'm sure you're all familiar with propaganda, and this is just a very subjective and intentionally misleading form of it. We'll talk about it more in detail. Law and order is basically the criminalization of the other. If you have this idea of a hierarchy, there are people who exist outside the hierarchy, and there are also people who exist which are direct threats to it. So in Franco's Spain, fascist Spain, or Mussolini's fascist Italy, these are kind of socialist, communist, even people who might be kind of considered like right-wing Republicans in America's sense would be considered enemies because they still believe kind of in the sense of a democracy. And Nazism, which is, you can think of as fascism plus ultra, like, super far out racism. This is queer folk, the Jewish people, Africans, those with mental and physical disabilities, the Romani people, and so on and so forth. And so you use violence as a means of basically instilling this law and order. You need to kind of show that there are these enemies that exist in which you have to like take care of and deal with. And then violence for violence sake is kind of recognizing that fascists not only saw violence as just a means of, having their goals met, because it isn't unique to any kind of political ideology, but they saw it as kind of a virtue in itself. It's a revalidation of their dominance. And if you look, the reason why we kind of think of fascism as such a dangerous concept is the fact that it's just inherently violent, and they think of everything that's outside of what they believe in has to be met through force. And so this can be torture and assassinations, like what happened in early parts of Italy and Spain, executions, rape. And these are often practiced by paramilitary groups. But once these paramilitary groups become the actual standing army, then this violence gets enacted by other people in society. And we can see examples of that, like in the ghettos, the Night of Broken Glass, and other moments like this throughout history. So the unchecked persistence of fascist policies have short-term and long-term goals. This doesn't have to become dangerous only when a fascist takes over an entire country and then, decides to invade Poland. Fascist policies can affect individuals. I'm sure some of you are familiar with the white male who murdered 8 women, 6 of whom being Asian American, for reasons of his sex addiction, and using basically violence as a means of dealing with it and kind of blaming his sexual anxiety on these, sex workers, group of women. And so you can see a lot of the fascist values that we're just talking about just now, all encapsulating in this one moment. And I think it's important to identify that if these values are something that are often practiced in society, it makes a country much more susceptible for a fascist to utilize these values, get kind of massive appeal, and then further spread their ideologies until the movement becomes an actual threat to democracy. So we're going to identify the politics in more detail, understand the appeal of fascism, why we should be concerned and be worried about it, identify how societies encourage and placate fascists, connect the history of politics to the modern day, and discuss solutions to prevent an uprising in the future. So here's some historical fascists. The fellow on the top left is Giovanni Gentile, who we mentioned, who was neo-Hegelian, and Mussolini. These were the 2 men that really developed it as a philosophy that we know it as. Obviously, Gentile was more of the philosophy end, and Mussolini was one who enacted it and kind of made it much more violent and much more, not just ultra-nationalistic, but very much the violence virtues that we talked about earlier. And the bottom two were inspired by Mussolini. Of course, we know Adolf Hitler, who's probably the most famous Nazi, and then kind of the forgotten Franco brother of the fascist movement, which is Francisco Franco. The Spanish Civil War is very complicated, but to long story short, there was basically two groups fighting, many groups fighting, but can be broken down into the nationalists and the Republicans. The Republicans were kind of a hodgepodge of like people who were pro-democracy, or even people like communists and Bolsheviks. And then the fascist party was more of the elite wealthy, the nationalist, and then the fascists. And so we're going to talk a little bit more about Franco because he's going to tie into a lot of our later subjects, but this is just to give you an idea of who we're talking about when we talk about fascist in the historical sense of the 1930s. Now we're going to talk about more modern fascist, and proto-fascist as well. The gentleman on the top is Narendra Modi. He's India's prime minister, which is India right now is the largest democracy in the world. He is a very outspoken Hindu nationalist, and he has the hopes of basically making India into an ethno-state. You see, he may not have a paramilitary group, but he does. There are a lot of crimes that are happening and attacks that are happening to different communities based on the rhetoric, which is pushed not only by Modi, but by his own party. And he's associated with an organization called the RSS, a very old organization, one of its members in which murdered Gandhi in the 1940s, I believe. And they were also fascist sympathizers as well, due to a very complex history with the Nazi Germany and India, and this weird connection between Hitler and the idea of the Aryan race connected back to India as a country. We're not going to talk about Modi too much because I am not as well versed, and we're really going to kind of discuss the United States, but I want to recognize that very large democracies in the country are at risk of these fascists kind of taking full power. So the gentleman at the bottom is Donald J. Trump, former president of the United States and WWE Hall of Famer. He adheres to fascist policies almost down to a T, notably through the MAGA campaign. The Make America Great Again is a mythic past. The hierarchies of, between immigrants and, nationalists, ultranationalism, of course, was a big thing for him. The displacement of reality by calling things fake news. He not only saw the Democratic Party and kind of like people outside of his base as just like, adversaries, or he saw them as actual enemies of the state and referred to that to his base. And he of course attempted a insurrection during January 6th of 2021. This was at a point when a lot of fascist scholars who study fascism finally said that he was a fascist. I say proto-fascist because even though he adheres to all the values, he doesn't have the kind of affection of the state in which Franco and Mussolini and Hitler had. His was very performative, which is why I used the image of him kissing and hugging the American flag. I think this was taken in 2016 before he actually became president. But it kind of demonstrates that he was more of an opportunistic figure who understood fascism fairly well and utilized the values that exist in our country to kind of gain power. And we're going to talk about Trump in a little bit more detail. And I hope we can have some more discussions about this later on, because I'm sure we have maybe various degrees of people who may or may not agree with that. So what makes fascism appealing? Like, we're basically saying that the dominant social classes are the ones that basically benefit from a fascist system. But you see people like women, folks of lower economic classes, minorities, liberals, even leftists, who end up supporting a fascist movement. So the images at the bottom are not necessarily fair. There's a very small amount of women of color who actually voted for Donald Trump. And I need to recognize that it was the dominant classes, which would be, white Americans, that put him into power. But there were, movements and people who kind of lumped themselves with Donald Trump. And I kind of put the two images to contrast, like the fact that, these Latin women voting for Trump, and then the policies in which in the ICE detention centers in these camps which exist now, which directly affect Latin women. And how does this kind of happen? And how do fascists end up getting kind of swaying the masses in this way? And one thing I want to point out, if you look in the image of the two women, there's a gentleman with a MAGA hat in the bottom right corner who looks very much as confused as anyone else would about the situation. I just think it's kind of indicative to show that a lot of these folks don't see those women the same way they think they see them. Like, they don't see them as Trump supporters. He sees them no differently, possibly, than the people on the right. And that's something that kind of unfortunately happens to a lot of people who support fascism early on, who end up becoming victims of the movement later on. The reason why it's so appealing is because nationalism is a really simple solution to complex issues. The country's in decline, and a lot of these people kind of view their rights and opportunities as scarce and finite. The fears of immigrants is the idea that they'll take away jobs, not create them. The idea is that if you give more rights to minorities and other groups, that means you'll have less rights. Your privileges will be taken away. It recognizes the socioeconomic failings of liberalism while stating anxieties kind of towards a leftist revolution. I put this in the outline, but socialism and communism is not as big of a threat to the world like it was in the 1930s. And so it's been kind of replaced with this idea of globalization happening in the world right now. How all these economies are kind of converging to one thing, and globalism is kind of used as a term to kind of imply that there's this great, unified power that's going to, that's destroying the country, like destroying multiple countries, and nationalism needs to be restored. Like Brexit is an example of this. This isn't to say that Brexit is necessarily fascist, but it's ultra-nationalistic in that same way because of this fear of globalism, which is similar to how socialism was used during the 1930s and also during the Cold War. And of course, minorities and vulnerable groups are afraid of being grouped with the other. They want to basically kind of feel like they are part of the nation to avoid being attacked. In America, it's kind of referred as to kind of attaining a sense of like whiteness, this idea that you want to be like the social group, the dominant social group, to avoid being a victim of their attacks and of their like various like policies. It also weaponizes nostalgia, this kind of vague time when things were better. This is really common with fascists and common with a lot of different groups as well. And a fascist must follow all of these ideologies to be considered a fascist, like I mentioned earlier, but you only need to believe in one fascist policy or fascist value in order to enable a fascist movement. What this means is that you don't have to be a complete fascist to vote for a fascist, but as long as you have one of the beliefs, anti-intellectualism. So say you think COVID is fake and it's a hoax, that might give you a reason to vote for someone like Donald Trump. Even though you may not be a racist, you are a racist, so you want to vote Donald Trump because you feel like he's going to kind of make America great again in the sense of kind of a white dominant hierarchy. You might have had sexual anxiety about Hillary Clinton becoming president, and that was the reason why you voted for Donald Trump. So it's just to say that it doesn't take a lot for a fascist to end up swaying the masses. This doesn't mean that people who voted for Trump or voted for fascists in history are evil or bad people. It's just that they have these values which were manipulated. And most people, myself included, possess at least one of these fascist values, whether it be sexual anxiety, anti-intellectualism, just certain things that you just might believe in that you have to take a lot of work to undo and address. So what is the US mythic past? Best way to think of it is kind of the ideas of manifest destiny. You might see these images in your history books where it kind of paints the conquering of indigenous land as kind of this God-given right of like basically us like a superior culture existing and basically taking over the land. We befriended the Native Americans, and we had some workers from Africa who volunteered to come out and help build the land. And you kind of paint it in this very almost childlike Disney-fied way of American history. So it makes it harder for you to kind of demarcate the history that you're taught as a child to what the reality is today. And the actual US past is much more bleak in a lot of ways. The image at the top left is one of Uncle Sam literally giving a horrible caricature of an Asian American the boot, which was part of a lot of the things like the Chinese Exclusion Act and a lot of heavy racist anti-immigration policies that existed at the time. Right to that is, of course, the Jim Crow laws and segregation, which existed where people of different like ethnic backgrounds couldn't even use the same water fountains. Excuse me. At the bottom left is one people may not be as familiar with. There were schools that existed in the United States in which they would take Native and indigenous people from their homes and of their communities and put them in these schools to basically strip them of their ethnic identities, cut their hair and kind of make them appear more Eurocentric. There's actually a term for this of killing the savage, saving the man. And this was practiced a lot and it was very traumatizing. It was actually a form of like cultural genocide because you would basically strip an entire generation of people from their culture and just the really unique ways in which we did a lot of the things which are considered fascist values. The bottom right one is from a group called the Patriot Front, which is a very far right organization, and they had these signs about not stolen, conquered, kind of this idea that a greater race or a greater culture existed and took over the other culture, and basically stripping away any of the crimes that happened, just saying that it's part of this greater good, that, you know, America is great because of these horrible things. And so the mythic past can be either this idea that, you know, it wasn't that bad, the things that happened in America's history is not that bad, or yeah, it was that bad, but it's for the better because we're the better culture, both of which are a myth, and that Keep America American will come up again. So keep an eye out for that. The other one is hierarchies. We have three that we're going to discuss today: class hierarchies, racial hierarchies, and then gender hierarchies. When we say racial hierarchies and white supremacy, this is only in the United States. Of course, different countries, different places have different hierarchical structures based on race, but we're going to talk about the United States today. Class hierarchies is basically kind of the separation between the rich and the poor. This is the best example. This is income inequality, that wealth gap, which was talked about in Robert Rake's documentary. And then, of course, the gender hierarchy, which is best exists the patriarchy. And we have to recognize, because gender is fluid, this hierarchy isn't just men and women, it's also men, gay men, lesbian women, trans folks, gender nonconforming people, and other groups as well. You don't have to be an active participant in reinforcing a hierarchy to benefit from its existence. So for example, I am a straight male, so I'm in one part of the top of the hierarchy. I'm a Black male in America, so not very much on the top of another hierarchy. And I'm kind of broke, but I'm not like houseless or, you know, in object poverty. So I'm in a pretty decent place in the income inequality. And so you can kind of use this as a very, very, very like blank kind of idea of where you stand kind of in the hierarchy in the United States. So we're going to kind of give it like kind of the logical breakdown of a hierarchy. It basically goes, this is the thought process of someone who adheres to this fascist value. This nation was great when we, the dominant culture, were in charge. We were in charge because we are inherently great, either because of genetics, God made us that way, our culture, our history, etc. And then the next thought is, we were great when we had all the power. Now that they are getting more power, things have gotten worse. Therefore, we need to reinforce a hierarchy in order to save our nation, either through anti-immigration policies, promoting inequity, ignoring the history in the present, and the violent suppression of social progress. This was done in Germany as far as after kind of the, this happened in Germany once there was this new kind of like socially democratic government which existed. This happened in Italy, and this of course happened in the United States after we had a Black president and then the chance of a woman president, as well as like all this social progress that was going on in the early, 2010s and 2000s, where there was kind of this fear that America is getting worse because of these things, not because of these deeper socioeconomic ails, but because of this other group, which is now getting more power. So class hierarchy, we're going to talk about how these hierarchies are reinforced. Class hierarchies are often reinforced by policies and actions which maintain wealth inequality. The man at the top is Jeff Bezos, the richest man in the world, known for, being I think he just stepped down, but like the CEO of Amazon. And it's also known that his workers have really terrible and poor conditions. A lot of them are battling to even attempt to unionize to be able to have better wages in order to make a better living. And it's important to discuss that these hierarchies are enforced through doing things like disrupting unions, low minimum wage or having no minimum wages at all, which is known as slave labor, tax cuts for the wealthy, deregulation of industries to favor the wealthy. That happened in the United States with the housing market, which we all know how that went in 2008. Austerity, and then the destruction of the means of social mobility were also practiced. I know this was talked about a little bit about the means of gaining social mobility is education, healthcare, and property ownership. Those are just some basic examples. And if it's too expensive for you to go to school, if you have to worry about healthcare costs and you got to pay an arm and a leg to save an arm and a leg, or you can't afford rent because you live in the Bay Area, these are all means of like reinforcing class hierarchy, because there's no means for you to build wealth in order to create generational wealth. Racial hierarchies are reinforced in a more unique way, because these are kind of more based in this idea of white supremacy, which is connected to class, but not necessarily. You can have someone who is a poor white male try to reinforce a racial hierarchy. And the most common way is kind of creating that other, and that's through the criminal justice system. And historically, we've had things like slave catchers, which in the early 17th, 18th century, you would have Africans who would try to flee from their masters and then be captured and then given back to their captives. And these are some of like kind of the first iterations of what we now know as the police in some like cities and states. The mass incarceration, the prison industrial complex, things like ICE, these are often used as means of kind of creating this tough on crime idea and trying to police the other. And we know about this because there are things like, Joe Biden's 1994 crime bill, or just different policies of the war on drugs, in which you have certain groups of people being painted as the criminal and the other, and then these policies existing in order to reinforce that. And it ties back to even a greater dehumanization of these same groups of people, such as during slavery or the aforementioned schools where they would erase indigenous culture and ideology. Example of this is redlining, voter suppression, promoting racial purity, over-policing minority communities, hate crimes, property seizures, work discrimination. There's so many different forms of it. But one thing I do want to point out is that in a country where there's a racial hierarchy that's existed before, even if it may not be as reinforced, if you reinforce a class hierarchy, it's inherently going to reinforce a racial hierarchy in the United States. And the hierarchies are all interconnected with one another. And we'll discuss that more in a bit in detail. Okay, so if you guys know, the gentleman on the right is Harry Styles. Are we good? Gentleman on the top right is Harry Styles from One Direction. This is a photo of him when he was in Vogue, he was in Vogue magazine, and he was, photographed wearing a dress. And there's this fairly well-known grifter named Candace Owens. And I'm going to kind of quote what she says, because it's really interesting, because it kind of encapsulates a lot of what we're discussing today. There's no society that can survive without strong men. The East knows this. In the West, the steady feminization of our men at the same time as Marxism is being taught to our children is not a coincidence. It's an outright attack. Bring back manly men. And so, this example of a straight male singer wearing a dress for a photo shoot being connected to the rise of Marxism and the fall of an empire is ridiculous, but it connects to this idea, which a lot of, and I'm saying Candace Owens is a fascist, but what I'm saying is that the patriarchy is a system that's important to fascism. You guys might be very familiar with Nazism and this idea of racial hierarchies when you think of fascism, but gender hierarchies are very, very important, mostly because it's a system in which men hold the social, political, moral, and economic power over women and others. And in the social sense, it's reinforced by maintaining these traditional values, where the family unit and society as a whole is best maintained when men are in charge. And so this is often sexists will kind of use pseudoscience to create and reinforce this rigid hierarchy. These are things like saying there's no such thing as gender fluidity, or saying things like what Candace Owens is saying, because a dress is just a dress. It doesn't have any associations. They're Scottish, men in Scotland were considered very manly wearing a dress, and pink was considered a masculine color. It's a fluid thing. And the thing is that gender fluidity is a threat to the hierarchical structure, because if gender is made up, so is the power structure. And in the same way, one structure of one hierarchy, they're all connected. The kind of undoing and the unraveling of a hierarchy can affect the other hierarchies as well. And so what Candace Owens is saying is very ridiculous. She is accidentally making a point that these hierarchies are all interconnected. And because she is kind of giving red meat to a base of people who believe in these kind of things and kind of these hierarchies, that's why she said it. But in a more political sense, gender hierarchies are usually practiced through the control of basically taking autonomy of women's bodies, and also non-men as well. Something like, restricting gay people of having gay marriage is an example of reinforcing a gender hierarchy. Abortion laws is an example of that. Criminalization of sex workers is another form of that, where a person, typically some people might be, a majority of sex workers may be trans or women of color or whatever else. And criminalizing sex work is a means of stripping them of a means of making income, especially for those of lower classes. And so you can just see how all these are all connected. And if you do one thing in one gender hierarchy, it's going to affect those who are at the bottom of other hierarchies. We're going to go through this pretty quickly, but basically sexual anxiety, like I mentioned before, the reason why it exists is because if you think about the ways in which people can exude dominance, especially the paramilitary groups we talked about throughout history, they can exude their dominance through fighting and going in street fights and things like that, because they were historically street thugs. But they also exude this dominance through physical, emotional, and sexual violence, typically towards women around them in their communities. And when things like the Me Too movement happened, which kind of recognize and try to hold men accountable and question this hierarchical structure, there's kind of this anti-feminist rage, and it kind of tried to link feminism to Nazism, which is where you get the term like feminazi and things like that. And the reason why this exists is because fascists, especially those in racial, like in the more racist forms of fascism, tend to only perceive women as means of making the pure race and babies. And so controlling the sexuality or the sex of a woman usually comes down to this idea of only seeing them as like incubators for children, which of course is like not okay. And feminists don't want that to exist. And so what happens is you have this kind of anti-feminist sentiment. These are things like slut shaming, expressing contempt towards feminist movement, and engaging in bad faith discussions over trans people or gay marriage or other things like that. And it's something that you can see a lot on the internet. And these people may not even realize that it's adhering to this greater gender kind of hierarchy, this made up thing. So sexual anxiety in action, two examples that we're going to talk about is Proud Boys, which was this Western chauvinist group. Western chauvinism is basically kind of this idea of this dominant Western male culture. They have a lot of ties to a lot of neo-Nazi groups. And if you remember from the January 6th insurrection, a lot of Proud Boy members were present. It kind of existed as kind of like the little, if you remember the movie Little Rascals, it's like the He-Man Women's Haters group, except of 7-year-olds. They're men in their late 30s who talk about trying to, bring back the great Western culture. This is a more violent example of sexual anxiety in action. A more one that we kind of may joke about is something like, say, Ben Shapiro. Last year, this song called WAP came out, which I won't go into too much detail, but basically it was a song that talked about like women's sexuality, and it was sung by Cardi B and Megan Thee Stallion, two Black women. And there's like this whole kind of cultural like outrage and backlash towards this. You can see this recently with the artist Lil Nas X. I might be confusing some people right now, but basically what I'm trying to say is that there's always this group of people that tend to try to have this whole critique these things from a place of like moral indecency and try to wage this moral superiority, but it's usually coded in kind of this contempt towards feminism and liberalism. And this is what happens when, men get feminized, just like the things Candace Owens was talking about, which creates kind of this victimhood. A really important quote for this is, when you're accustomed to privilege, equality feels like oppression. The gentleman on the left is Elliot Rodger. He was kind of the more famous incels. Incels basically meant involuntary celibate. And these are men who really kind of exist and kind of connect on the internet, who basically kind of felt entitled to sex or felt like they were not getting sex from women because they weren't masculine or manly enough, which feminist and feminism kind of has a whole kind of place to discuss these issues and kind of undo that kind of sense of having to be a manly man. But these incels basically blame it on women. And Elliot Rodger murdered several women at UC Santa Barbara in, I believe, 2014, and wrote a manifesto basically talking about how he was owed sex and how he managed to make his issue about not having sex as a man and making himself into the victim to the point that he justified in his own head murdering innocent women. Another example of this is a Blue Lives Matter movement, which was a response to the Black Lives Matter movement, which was addressing kind of the systemic state violence towards Black people and people of color and people in general. And the backlash was this idea of a blue life, even though blue isn't a life, it's a job. And it was kind of this response that instead of actually maybe critiquing the system and maybe recognizing the privilege, the idea of people critiquing the police was a form of saying they hate the police and they want to do this and do that. And just that response, we'll discuss in more detail, but these are two examples of kind of victimhood, which is why you would see a lot of the Blue Lives Matter folks at the Capitol insurrection. And we'll talk about that more later on. Next is anti-intellectualism. Like I said, this is disdain for experts in social sciences, as well as art and history. The top image on the left is the appropriation of the pro-life movement of the My Body, My Choice, but about the mask. As you know, there is a subset of people who refuse to wear a mask or think that COVID is a hoax. And it's not really based on anything other than just kind of like this big distrust in the government, as well as kind of a misunderstanding of the science. And this is how the anti-vax movement and other things happen. Another form of this is cancel culture. I won't talk about this too much in detail because it is a pretty complex issue and probably worth its own lecture, but kind of this idea that if people say or do horrible things, being held accountable by a greater culture that exists on the internet is a form of like, canceling people or trying to eliminate them. When it's more based in kind of accountability, we might talk about that more in the discussion. But the example I wanted to point out, which to me is the funniest, is the political cartoon on the top right, where the woman is saying to presumably her husband about Trump being banned on Twitter, and Google suspending Parler, which was the app which organized a lot of the insurrection movement, and basically saying that it's like January 1984, like we're in this Orwellian nightmare, which is really funny because George Orwell is a famous anti-fascist and actually fought in the Spanish Civil War and was quoted saying that everyone should kill at least one fascist. So it's just funny that, like, you know, the people who are against, you know, Antifa and against like these kind of far left movements quote this man who famously is probably one of the most famous anti-fascist writers. So we'll discuss also law and order. This right here is an image of the US incarceration rates by ethnicity. And you'll notice that you'll have for every 100,000 people, Black people at the top, followed by Native American, Indigenous, Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander, Latinx, white, and Asian. I do have issues with the graph that Asian isn't put together with Pacific Islander, but that's a whole other conversation. But you kind of recognize that some of the historical things we talked about, the criminalization of the other, can be seen in the rates of police. If you think this is made by other, there's only two really logical conclusions you can make from these rates. Either people of certain races inherently, either through culture or genetics, are inferior and are more prone to crime, or there's systemic reasons why these people are getting criminalized more. And depending on which one you believe in, you might have belief in fascist ideology. The bottom left is of an ICE detention center, and the bottom right is one of Derek Chauvin, who was the officer who murdered George Floyd, who's currently on trial right now as we speak. And if you look at his hat, it doesn't say "Make America Great Again," it says "Make Whites Great Again," which is something people don't really discuss too much about him, but it kind of shows that this law and order, not to say all cops or police are like this, or even all military or people who are a part of the justice system are all fascist or people who are far right, but it attracts people like this inherently through the fact that it is a means of basically controlling and taking care of this quote unquote other that exists. And a lot of this criminalization of people kind of exists through propaganda. These are four images of like propaganda from the 1930s. The one on the far left is one where basically it's blaming this, as you can see, depiction of a rich Jewish man. It's his fault for the war. The one right to it is of Spanish Franco, of this guy sweeping up the Bolsheviks, which is like kind of a communist leftist kind of like ideology. The social injustice, separatist politicians, and then the Freemasons, because yes, the Freemasons and the Illuminati conspiracies are that old. And then one where it's basically an Italian saying, "Sending the man away off to war," where it depicts a kind of like a classic image of a mother holding a baby and the brave man going off to fight in war. And on the far left is the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. It was this book that was published in the early 1900s. And it basically is the groundwork for a lot of conspiracies we know to this day, which kind of says that, you know, this cabal of Jewish people hold all the political power, and they've caused all the wars, and they control the media and all these other stereotypes, which we still know to this day. This was very popular at the time. It spread throughout most of the world because of World War I. And people like Henry Ford would hand these out to people, and it was kind of seen as this very like pro-American kind of like the truth. And things like QAnon are inspired by this kind of old conspiracy literature, which is literally, you know, centuries old. So here's some more modern propaganda. The gentleman on the top right with no chin is Tucker Carlson. He's kind of a well-known far-right political pundit who's on Fox News. Far-right enough to kind of say things like calling immigrants, saying that they dirty up the country. He is someone who is kind of celebrated folks like Kyle Rittenhouse, who was a 17-year-old who had shot and murdered a couple of protesters during the 2020 BLM protest that happened at the time. This is a screenshot of him talking about George Soros and how George Soros, basically this Hungarian, very wealthy billionaire who actually experienced and lived through the Holocaust and spends a lot of money funding these social action and justice movements. And he's been kind of painted as a boogeyman in the same way that was practiced during the early 1900s, the Elders of Zion. The bottom cartoons are by the same guy named Ben Garrison, who's kind of a joke as like a very pro-Trump political cartoonist, where he literally shows Soros controlling the military, and above is the Rothschild family, kind of this old Jewish family seen as like this rich, corrupt family. So like literally showing that Soros is run by like a literal Jewish evil hand. And the one on the left is similar to the one of Franco sweeping up crime. It's Trump draining the swamp. And he has a cartoon of Hillary Clinton and, the typical thing, CNN, the Bush family, war, because, Trump very much was anti-war, I guess, according to Ben Garrison. and globalism, that term we talked about earlier, which is kind of the new boogeyman for socialism. And if you look at the tree in the cartoon of Trump at the bottom, you have George Soros as like this evil owl creature that's watching over everything. So these are like examples of far right propaganda, but modern propaganda exists in different ways. Another one is American Sniper, which is the image of Bradley Cooper, the actor on the top left. And it's a film that basically kind of talks about this soldier going through PTSD, which is a very serious topic and thing which should be discussed. And it kind of became, it was directed by Clint Eastwood, and it kind of was loved by both left and right and people in general. But it kind of exists as a similar kind of propaganda. This isn't to downplay kind of the effects of war that it has on men, but it whitewashes a lot of the things Chris Kyle believed. He was very much anti-Muslim and talked about how Muslims are dirty. He had fantasies about murdering Black people who were quote unquote looting during Hurricane Katrina, and actually claimed that he would snipe them. And, you know, just kind of this idea that we have, like, in American culture, we have this habit of kind of either having this very far right, cartoonishly ghoulish depiction of how society is run and these stereotypes. And then we have one that seems more innocent in comparison. But if you take it separately, it is this movie which basically makes this kind of illegal invasion of a country and paints it about how it affected this one very racist white soldier who was, you know, carrying out the will of the state. So the top left image is CNN, and the top right image is ESPN. And modern corporate news is kind of becoming more and more like ESPN, where it's really driven by clicks and controversy as a means of pleasing advertisers. This is very dangerous and really bad for democracy, because you basically have this like political sphere where the most controversial figure will inherently get more attention. The best example of this is Jeff Zucker, who is president of CNN currently, and he voiced interest in covering Trump back when Donald Trump was kind of seen as a joke candidate in 2015, because he knew that he would stir up controversy and get a lot of attention. So by March 2016, Donald Trump received like $2 billion in free airtime during his campaign, meaning it's almost like $2 billion worth of ads that he received just from coverage from CNN, and much, much more than any other 2016 candidate. And this is what happens when you have kind of this corporate media that exists that placates these controversial figures. The top left image, the gentleman in the bottom right, the guy with the blue tie with the white hair, that's Jeffrey Lord. He was actually hired by CNN to be a surrogate for Donald Trump. And they hired him in order to kind of create these moments of arguing to kind of create this outrage in a similar way people might do about a sports team. The difference is, you know, ESPN is talking about football teams and sports, and they're talking about politics that like affect everyone's lives. Jeffrey Lord was later fired because he kept saying, alluding to Nazism and talking about Trump, and it says things like "Sig Heil" and Trump and this and that. But it kind of just shows that that our corporate media is not very responsible when it comes to discussing the dangers of far right or even far left or any type of far political movement, as long as it's controversial and as long as it makes them money. Jeff Zucker was hired by CNN because he was really great at NBC, where he greenlit a show called The Apprentice, which made Trump kind of a household figure in the 2000s. So there's that. So authoritarian leaders tend to be very charismatic and have a great grasp of understanding how to sway the masses. Trump historically is not a popular president, but he does have kind of this sense of appeal, which ends him up in positions like hosting SNL in 2016, or having late night show actor and famous blackface star Jimmy Fallon rub his head and kind of show, like, you know, as a means of just showing how friendly and fun he is. And while some people might have been able to detect the greater danger that Trump held, especially after January 6th, a lot of folks didn't in the beginning, especially these kind of like corporate media conglomerates, because they were more focused on benefiting and being beholden to shareholders. And so the things that are going to bring in more views are the things in which that they're going to like cover and show, which means if we get another fascist leader who is even close to being as charismatic as Donald Trump, or another figure like that, there's a good chance that CNN and other groups won't resist covering them up to the point that they put them into a position of power. And while historically, the 1930s, we had issues of journalism kind of like placating and kind of like making fashion celebrities, we don't have something, they didn't have the issue we do now, which is social media. There are places like YouTube and Facebook make tons of money by keeping people on their websites, and people stay on the websites of basically being fed things and ideas in which they agree with, which creates this confirmation bias and kind of this like feedback loop of information. As a result, people actually end up getting radicalized through the internet. QAnon is a good example of people going on YouTube and just clicking random videos and being led down these rabbit holes. There was a YouTube algorithm where they found that the longer people stayed on longer if they watched videos about conspiracy videos. And so people like Alex Jones or like QAnon conspiracy videos or Flat Earth, the Flat Earth movement were started up due to these algorithms. And even 64% of white militia group members were recommended by Facebook's algorithm. And the same issue, Mark Zuckerberg and Google and these other organizations are, they're more beholden to building profits for their companies, which makes it really dangerous because they, whether it be the like fake news about COVID, fake news in general, or disinformation, these websites and these platforms like supercharge that to the extent that it's really easy for a fascist movement to kind of be cultivated on the internet. Which all of this is glued together by violence as a virtue. There's kind of this there isn't real, while fascism has a philosophical identity, these people that you see in these images and even Nazi Germany weren't just reading Gentile and Mussolini. These are people who have this vague idea of Americanness. And so as a result, kind of have this like childlike perception of it as a concept. We're gonna kind of brush through this a little bit faster. So the United States has always kind of had some of these. I would argue that the Confederacy is one of the first iterations of the fascist movement. And America's history of eugenics laws and genocides and even imperialistic foreign policies were all kind of meant in this way of kind of being built as a means of like building profit for the nation. You have this dehumanization of Black people, which was done to justify slavery. You have this movement that happened of Keep America American, which was a byproduct of the fear of a socialist government taking over in the United States. And because America had this history and there was this platform, the fascism of Nazism was fascism plus the Confederacy. And so the Nuremberg laws, which were these race laws created to basically criminalize Jewish people, were developed and inspired and actually written by people who were reading Confederate laws and Jim Crow laws. And Hitler and Mein Kampf even mentions the United States as kind of this example of what a white nation should look like. And the image on the right is a man being measured for his nose to see how Aryan he is, which goes back to the anti-intellectual pseudoscience. Even before Trump, so all these companies that you see here, IBM, Chase Bank, Coca-Cola, Dow Jones, GM, and Ford, they were all these companies that actually helped the Nazis in certain ways. Chase actually would freeze the accounts of Jewish families trying to escape Europe, which basically set them up to be murdered. You guys read Emily Black's IBM and the Holocaust and the ways which IBM made it possible for the Holocaust to even happen. Dow, GM, and Ford, and Coca-Cola just had business dealings with the Third Reich at the time. And classical liberalism, which my colleague and friend David Wilson discussed in one of his own of Neoliberalism and Violence, talks about this idea that neoliberal capitalism and the foundation of it is the exploitation that built the United States, like the chattel slavery, like exploiting workers, getting rid of basically kind of having this fight against the working class people or even the working poor. And modern neoliberalism, capitalism inherently favors socioeconomic hierarchies. And because capitalism is inherently an economic hierarchy, it reinforces the other three hierarchies that we talked about before. We talked about Franco a little bit earlier, but Franco actually stayed in power after World War II because he was an important asset to fight against the communists during the Soviet during kind of the Cold War. And so even actual fascists, even after the World War II was done and we recognize, Hitler to be this really awful, figure, we still worked with fascists because it benefited our country. It benefited, this economic system that we have. And now that we have Trump has been in office, there is now this growing fascist movement that exists in the GOP. And it's been in the United States since the Confederacy. And with social media and the internet and the popularity of Trump, there's another figure that might come up in the future and weaponize and utilize this growing fascist movement to end up gaining power. And there's no guarantee that we'll vote this person out. And there's no guarantee that if another fascist attempts an insurrection, they won't have things like the police and military on their side. And as you can see, a lot of these values that we talked about, these mirror closely a lot of the other organizations in our country, like the police. The people at the top are MJT, she was the woman who said that California wildfires are caused by Jewish lasers. She's kind of an example of a neat, kind of a proto, modern fascist. Josh Hawley's a senator who, I may not call him a fascist, but he's somebody who has been very supportive of the whole idea that Joe Biden it was a whole fraud election and supporting the insurrection, which in itself is a fascist action. And then we talk about Tucker Carlson, also seen with no chin. So this all sounds bad, but what do we do about this? Historically, anti-fascist movements are not extremely far left. I might identify as being someone who's politically far left, I'll be honest, but you don't need that in order to have an anti-fascist movement. Whether it be in Spain or in the United States even, anti-fascist movements historically have been kind of this unification of people who just know that we want a democracy. We want a system to discuss and have discourse and build all of these things, which is a way to fight and prevent fascism from growing. But you need to get rid of the spaces which incubate it, which means you need anti-fascist politics. So think of all the politics we talked about before, the undoing of hierarchies, investing in education and social sciences and history, movements to support social and economic justice. The opposite of law and order is restorative justice. And think of Sandel and the idea of basically being virtuous and making sure that people have their basic needs, having rehabilitation instead of punishment, and recognizing that resistance is necessary because fascist movements are inherently violent and they see it as a virtue. So at some point you will have to engage with fascist. And also if you embody anti-fascist movements and have systemic reform, what you end up doing is making it harder for a fascist to pull off of something. If you have a system in which, men don't possess sexual anxiety towards women getting more rights, or the idea that gender is fluid, or that Lil Nas X can make a video of him, twerking or whatever, and no one gets upset about it. It's a joke, but like honestly, it's multifaceted. Just like how fascism takes over the culture and takes over culture and history and the government and these police forces and these things, anti-fascism has to work in the same kind of way. It's important to recognize that during the insurrection on January 6th, a lot of people discouraged people from actually counter-protesting the people at the MAGA march. And as a result, because there was no one to stop them, they got into the Capitol and they attempted to murder everyone from AOC to Mike Pence, which was, if you remember the Night of Long Knives, that's kind of the similar thing that happened with the Purge, where they murdered people like Ernst Röhm and other figures at the time who were considered right-wing, and even allies of a fascist movement end up being hurt by them, because anything that doesn't adhere to this very narrow concept of fascism is a victim of it. So you have to abolish and reform these systems in order to kind of save society. Otherwise, we will have our own World War III. And that is the end of the lecture. Any questions or thoughts?